Welcome back to our series, The Story of the Global Order. In this second chapter, we explore a tectonic shift that reshaped the destiny of nations and the very essence of human identity. This is the story of the French Revolution, a fire that ignited in the heart of Europe and set the modern world ablaze. There are very few turning points in human history as important as the French Revolution. The French Revolution not only eliminated the last traces of the feudal order in Western Europe, but also clearly demonstrated that the absolute and universal monarchical form of government was unsustainable. At the same time, it created an impact at least as significant as the teachings of Adam Smith for the establishment of the modern economic system. The French Revolution also triggered a series of revolutions over 150 years, much like a major fault line. This series began with the French Revolution of 1789 and reached its peak with the July Revolution of 1830 and the Revolution of 1848, which shook Europe. Although it was thought that the age of revolutions ended with the Revolution of 1848, the revolutionary wave would return in the 20th century with the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and the October Revolution of 1917. Just as the teachings of Adam Smith, known as the father of capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution, created a new capital class, the French Revolution would suddenly turn millions of people living in hunger into citizens or compatriots. These movements, which were unrelated and even contradictory to each other, would reduce the economic and political influence of the noble class in Western Europe and form the basis of today's political and economic order. When the calendar showed the year 1789, France was the most populous country in Europe with a population of 26 million. Although France was the most powerful state in Europe in the 18th century, it had borne the heavy burden of endless great wars during that same century. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1713, and the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, were massive struggles across all of Europe between two blocs under either French or British leadership. The final reckoning of these two wars would be seen in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which some historians call the First World War. The British Empire would emerge from the 7 Years' War as an undisputed superpower in victory. The War of the Spanish Succession and the War of the Austrian Succession did not lead to significant territorial losses for France despite the defeat of the French coalition. However, the 7 Years' War led to the loss of French colonies and trade privileges in today's North America, the Caribbean Sea, and India. And these critical losses were irreplaceable for the French economy. During the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, France fought against the British Empire alongside Spain on the side of the Americans, and the French Navy played a vital role in winning the war. However, keeping a large navy ready and making it fight in the Atlantic drove the final nail into the coffin of the French economy. So much so that in 1779, while the British Empire had 90 large ship-of-the-line warships, the collapsed French economy was trying to keep 63 large warships at sea. The British had advantages such as profitable international trade to finance this navy, newly acquired colonies, and a public debt managed with low interest rates. The loss of 3 major wars and the American War of Independence were not the only reasons for the collapse of the French economy. Since the 1730s, the flow of new gold from mines discovered in Brazil had been increasing the money supply based on precious metals for decades, raising all prices in the international system. While the population in Europe nearly doubled in the last 100 years due to wealth coming from colonies, agricultural output in France had fallen with the bad harvests of the 1780s. Almost all of the population in France, except for the nobles and members of the church, was suffering from hunger and poverty. There was such a relentless hunger that families began to mourn when a new child was born. Half of the babies were dying of hunger and disease before reaching the age of 2. The French tax system was regressive, that is, it was proportional in a way that increased relative to income from the top income class downwards. Nobles in the church were almost exempt from taxes. While the French king had unlimited authority over expenditures, income generation was left to 13 local administrations known as parlements. Although the word parlement in French passed into English as parliament, the French parlement had nothing to do with a parliament or an assembly. French parlement units were local administrations led by nobles, where judges and tax officials formed the bureaucracy, and it was these who collected the state's income. As you can imagine, those who bore the burden of the tax were the peasants and the bourgeois classes. The famous economist David Weir, in an article published in 1989, explains that while French state debt reached 55.6% of the national income before the Revolution, the French state paid as much interest as England, whose public debt nearly reached 181.8% of its national income, due to the risk of bankruptcy. The interest on high British public debt was low because it was financed by colonies with rich resources and the unrivaled British merchant fleet in global trade. This example from exactly 250 years ago strikingly proves that high public debt is not dangerous when financed with the right interest and when it flows into the right jobs and proetchka, but the opposite is also true. France's distorted tax system is the biggest cause of the revolution. Peasants did not have enough food to survive after paying taxes in kind from their harvest to the monseigneurs, the nobles to whom they were bound. Just as additional taxes on England's 13 colonies triggered the American War of Independence, hungry and angry peasants and the bourgeoisie who harbored a grudge against the nobles would light the fire of the French Revolution. The Swiss banker Jacques Necker, who tried to reform the French financial system, would be fired months after establishing a real state accounting system and creating an excellent state budget in 1781. Necker's suggestion that France should definitely not be involved in the American War of Independence would also be ignored. When Necker was called back to duty in 1788, it was already too late for everything. Indeed, the revolution would start days after he was dismissed on July 11, 1789, and ordered to leave the country immediately. His successor, Joseph Foulon de Doux, would be hanged from a lamppost by revolutionaries 2 weeks later. The final development that lit the fuse of the revolution was the gathering of the États de Généraux, which had not met since 1614, by the king in order to resolve the economic situation. The parlements managed by the nobles had rebelled against the king and were opposing the imposition of new taxes on the church and the nobility. The only way for the king to pass a new tax law was to reconvene the États de Généraux, a general assembly. The États de Généraux consisted of 3 parts: the clergy, 303 delegates, the nobility, 282 delegates, and the commons, the bourgeois class, 578 delegates. The base upon which this forced assembly rested was quite strange. While members of the clergy consisted of approximately 100,000 people, and the noble class of 400,000 people, the commons constituted 98% of the population. The representatives of the commons were lawyers, merchants, landowners, and bureaucrats. These people were steeped in the thoughts brought forth by the works of intellectuals like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The majority of the clergy representatives were local priests, and they were aware of the misery the people were in. Within months, this strange assembly would turn into an assembly where the commons were fully sovereign, namely the National Assembly, Assemblée Nationale, with the support of some priests and nobles. This new assembly would be the heart of the revolution. Moreover, the new assembly had gained public support in Paris and control over some French military elements. The most important name in this development was the young General Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette, a hero of the American War of Independence. It is thought that the French Revolution began with the people storming the Bastille prison on July 14, 1789, but this is not true. The revolution essentially began on June 17, 1789, with the declaration of the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly. Besides, there were only 7 prisoners in the Bastille. The revolutionaries had attacked the Bastille to seize the weapons and ammunition inside. With the people, along with some soldiers, rioting in Paris and attacking the Bastille, the National Assembly became the de facto legislative and executive organ of France. The initial aim of the Assembly was not to establish a republican regime, but to establish a constitutional royal regime. However, the new assembly was not strong enough to control the crowds of people who had risen up in anger. While the bureaucrats and ministers of the hated old regime, ancien régime, were being lynched in the cities, the peasants targeted the nobles and tax collectors. Chateaux and mansions were being burned and looted. The genie was out of the bottle now. In the cities, those targeted were being hanged from lampposts by crowds, with cries of "à la lanterne," to the lamppost. Execution with the national razor, or Madame Guillotine, as the guillotine was known, was not yet very common. Meanwhile, the nobles fleeing the country had begun to gather mercenaries with the wealth they could smuggle out. The military units starting to gather on the northeastern borders of France were a threat to the new regime. While the Assembly took control of all armed elements and the army against new threats, it also formed armed militias in rural areas. Meanwhile, the basic Declaration of Citizenship and Human Rights, La Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, was published. This declaration would be the conceptual basis of the French Constitution in 1791. The king would be forced to approve the Constitution reluctantly. However, the revolution was no longer under the control of either the Assembly or the army. The balance and division of duties between the king and the National Assembly could not last very long. The Assembly and the country were divided into various political factions. Because these factions sat together on the right and left of the Parliament, they also created the definitions of the modern political world. The monarchists, for example, Necker was also in this group, aimed to reverse a significant part of the change brought by the revolution. This wing formed the classic conservative view of the country. They sat on the right side of the Assembly. The Girondins formed the right and liberal wing of the revolution. At the same time, because they supported the spread of the revolution to other countries, they ensured that war was declared on Austria and Prussia in 1792. The greatest share in the deposition and execution of the king belonged to them. They formed the right wing of the famous Jacobin Club. They sat on the left side of the Assembly. The Montagnards, La Montagne, formed the left and extreme wing of the Jacobin Club. This movement was particularly skilled at playing to the pulse of the crowds, armed to the teeth in Paris. This group took its name because they sat on the left and upper rows of the Parliament. The movement had 3 factions within itself: a group closer to the right under the leadership of Danton, the group named Cordelier further to the left of the left, and the Robespierre group in the middle of the two. Robespierre would first liquidate the Girondins, then destroyed Danton and his followers in the Cordeliers movement. The Feuillants had adopted a center-right view and were of the identity that the revolution should end with the establishment of the Constitution. According to this group, the new regime should continue as a parliamentary monarchy. Later, the guillotine would descend relentlessly upon them as well. The egalitarians are the early socialists. These would somehow escape Robespierre's hands later, but the subsequent Directory government would send them to the guillotine. There was also a large group known as centrists, who were populists who did not show their true colors, and sat between the Jacobin Club and the monarchists. They were numerous, and would side with the strong factions according to the prevailing wind. Today's political concepts of right and left originated from this seating arrangement in the Assemblée Nationale. The father of the revolution was the Jacobin Club, formed together by the Girondins and the Montagnards. A typical bourgeois club, entry to the Jacobin Club was by paying a fee. Later, when the Girondins were liquidated in this club, this bourgeois custom would also disappear. Gradually, this movement took on a more radical identity. Now, the main power of these clubs rested on the people of Paris, which had a population of 600,000, half of whom were unemployed and becoming an increasingly dangerous identity. These were named sans-culottes. 3 years after the revolution, the Jacobin Club, which was dominant in the assembly, was trying to cope with increasing inflation, monarchist rebellions, and the armies gathered by the nobles. The people, especially the bourgeoisie in Paris, were reacting to the massive inflation. The reason for the inflation was simple. The Assembly had printed 100 million livres in 1789 and 200 million livres in 1790. The revolution had changed the tax system but had not solved the supply problems. The seizure of the assets of the Church, which owned 10% of all lands in 1790, disturbed devout Catholic regions like Normandy, Vendée, and Brittany. The rebellion that broke out in Vendée, 1793 to 1796, would lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Some historians state that the methods used in suppressing the Vendée rebellion were the first genocide of modern history. By 1791, many remnants of the old regime had been removed, but new institutions could not be put in their place. In 1792, the flight of the king and queen from Paris to Varennes and their forced return to Paris, and the war that started with Austria and Prussia, would strengthen the radical Jacobin Club. The number of Jacobins in the 749-member assembly had reached 360. On September 22, 1792, the Republic was declared. Eventually, the Jacobin majority would ensure the trial and execution of the king and queen for treason in 1793. With the execution of the king, England, Spain, Naples, and Holland also joined the war against France. The city of Toulon was blockaded by the British Navy. A young French colonel would show tremendous success in Toulon with his intelligence and cold-bloodedness. This colonel, who was promoted to brigadier general, was given command of the Italian army. The name of this young officer was Napoleon Bonaparte. The war started by external powers. To crush the revolution brought out the feeling of patriotism in the armies consisting of volunteers fighting for the fatherland. This was another political approach brought forth by the French Revolution: nationalism. The beginning of nationalism rests on France's fight with international coalitions. Unlike their rivals, the French armies consisted of citizen soldiers filled to the core with the fire of patriotism. Most of these soldiers knew that external powers wanted to invade France to crush the revolution. In 1793, the Montagnards carried out a masterful coup in the National Assembly and liquidated the Girondins by accusing them of treason. The famous Montagnard leader, lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, would take power by liquidating his rivals within the Montagnard faction this time. In the famous La Concorde Square of Paris, the guillotine had become relentlessly operational. The process named the Reign of Terror had begun. Tens of thousands of people would lose their heads to the national razor. While Robespierre was liquidating his rivals to establish the ideal republic in his own words, he was not in full control of the assembly and the streets. Moreover, the fear that any person accused by Robespierre could be tried and executed within a few days had united the National Assembly and the streets against him. The sans-culottes who brought him to power would turn against Robespierre this time. Robespierre would be arrested in a counter-coup, tried with his supporters the next day, and sent to the guillotine on the same day, July 28, 1794. The Reign of Terror had ended. However, in the rest of France, radical Jacobins would be lynched or sent to the guillotine. The successes of the revolutionary armies in Italy and Holland would not be able to fix the economy that had collapsed internally. Hunger would trigger a new Paris uprising in 1795, and the Jacobins would be declared scapegoats for this course of events, with a new wave of arrests and executions sweeping through France. In 1795, a new constitution that would soften the French Revolution was accepted. Now the assembly was divided into two. The lower assembly of 500 people would perform the legislative duty, and the Council of Ancients of 250 people, having members over 40 years old, would approve the laws. The executive would be implemented by 5 directors. For this reason, this period between 1795 to 1799 is called the Directory period. The 5-member board of directors had been invented to prevent the emergence of a new Robespierre. While the lower assembly held the legislature and finance, the directors had the power given by decrees with the force of law and the armed forces under their command. The coalition that removed Robespierre was known as the Thermidorians. This name comes from the calendar created by the French Revolution. Their leaders held 3 directorships, including Paul Barras's. 40% of the lower assembly consisted of their own members, 40% of centrists and moderate Jacobins, and the rest consisted of monarchists. The monarchists were about to pull the centrist members, who had no political color, to their side when the Directory administration sensed the approaching danger. It decided to liquidate its rivals with an internal coup. With the order of the administration, the units under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, returning from Italy, began to arrest monarchists in Paris. Napoleon had ordered his soldiers to fill their cannons with grape shot in the narrow streets of Paris. The cannons filled with grape shot mowed down the rebels like machine guns, which would be invented 60 years later, when fired from close range. Extreme Jacobins were also the target of this internal coup, along with the monarchists. This time the guillotine did not work much. The members arrested in the assembly were exiled to French Guiana, a penal colony. Now Napoleon Bonaparte had become a powerful man in a military and political sense. His ambitions were incredible. Now it was his turn to carry out a coup. The French armies could not get results in the Egypt and Syria campaign. The people were fed up with the corruption in the Directory period and realized that the coalitions could not solve the problems. The Jacobins were getting stronger again in Paris. Moreover, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother was also the president of the lower assembly. After the coup was planned for months, the assembly was raided and dispersed, and the directors were persuaded to give their resignations. 25-member commissions were established from the lower and upper assemblies, and all power was gathered in 3 consuls, in a way befitting the classic Roman period. However, the consuls were not equal. Napoleon Bonaparte would first become a dictator as the first consul. It is understood that Napoleon took Julius Caesar as an example. Have a new constitution prepared. This constitution would be accepted with a rate of 99.94% in a fraudulent referendum, and then 5 years later, on December 2nd, 1804, he would become the first French emperor. Moreover, while Napoleon was being crowned as emperor, he had Pope Pius VII brought to Paris. In this unforgettable ceremony, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hand. The custom is for the king or emperor to wait for the Pope to put on the crown while kneeling in front of him, and recklessly put it on his own head. Then his wife Josephine knelt before him, and he personally put the crown on the empress. The crown he wore was not the crown of the French king. That crown had been destroyed in the Revolution. Napoleon's crown was made inspired by the early medieval crown of the famous Emperor Charlemagne, 748 to 814, who had dreamed of conquering and uniting Europe. Pope Pius VII ended this theater by saying, "Vivat Imperator in aeternum," long live the emperor forever. The Pope played the role assigned to him reluctantly. After all, French soldiers were in Italy. The new emperor's crown would be the outward expression of Napoleon's ambitions. The end of the 10 years that changed the world was this magnificent theater. With which ideals had the French Revolution started, and how did it end? While Charles Dickens's famous novel A Tale of Two Cities perfectly describes how the revolution came step by step, the tremendous poverty the people were in, and how the revolution developed, 1757 to 1793. Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables tells the life of Jean Valjean, who had to steal a loaf of bread after 19 years of imprisonment following the Napoleon Wars, 1815 to 1832. In fact, the French Revolution and the Napoleon Wars had not eliminated the poverty and hunger of the people. What happened to the millions of people who died. Our Story of the Global Order series will continue with Part 3, exploring the tectonic shifts of the Napoleonic Wars, 1799 to 1815. To experience history through immersive visuals, follow, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Like if you enjoyed this journey. Have a day full of learning.